In 2025, Germany, the leading economic power in Europe, is going through a pivotal period marked by profound upheavals on political, economic, and social levels. The country is facing almost zero growth, an industrial sector in crisis, and rising social tensions. Just a year ago, Chancellor Olaf Scholz saw his coalition collapse and put his future to a vote of confidence, which he lost on December 16. The federal elections to renew the seats in the Bundestag will take place in February 2025. And what a shock. Although the Christian Democratic Union Christian Social Union came out on top with 28% of the votes, behind them, Scholz's Social Democratic Party failed for the first time since 1887 to be among the top two political forces. With only 16% of the votes, it is the Alternative for Germany that, for the first time since its creation in 2013, comes in second and grabs 20% of the votes. The social definition, German democracy, is collapsing. The Greens are melting away like snow in the sun, and the future of Germany will be determined between the Christian Democrats, who are struggling to reconnect with the business successes of the Merkel era. Facing the Alternative for Deutschland, Chancellor Merz has only been in office since May 2025, with a dual objective: to regain the trust of the conservative and business-minded German electorate, and to block the Alternative for Germany, even if it means going back on what the Christian Democratic Union once forbade itself to do in this area. I know that from France, Germany is often misunderstood, or even worse, but the recent developments in the German situation will also determine the future of the European continent. To fall into political events, that's what Adenauer used to say. And of course, the transition of the chancellorship between Olaf Scholz and Friedrich Merz in 2025 is a reflection of a Germany undergoing a profound change, or even a double deadlock that is anything but accidental, both economic and social. Merz, representative of the Christian Democratic Union, was propelled to the position of chancellor in May 2025 at the head of a fragile coalition with the outgoing Social Democratic Party, a marriage of convenience rather than love in a political landscape marked by choices made by default rather than popular enthusiasm and reasons of state. This black-red coalition, as it's called in Germany, which refers to the alliance between the CDU, Christian Social Union, and the Social Democratic Party, is the fourth of its kind in the history of the German Federation. However, it struggles to hide its internal divisions and therefore its fragility. On budget policy, Merz is pushing for more discipline, while the Social Democrats are afraid of sacrificing the last social safety nets for the energy transition. Each claims priority, and the goals seem increasingly out of reach. On migration, the Christian Democratic Union is trying to contain the rise of the Alternative for Germany and is imposing stricter controls. The end of family reunification, the revision of naturalizations, to the dismay of progressives. This explosive mix is delaying reforms and fueling uncertainty and inaction since the crisis just a year ago of the Scholz coalition. At the same time, the Alternative for Germany party is making the most of the situation by capitalizing on popular discontent and a clear stance. Part of the population, especially in the eastern regions, no longer believes in the promises of the Christian Democratic Union or Social Democratic Party governments, which have been succeeding each other for decades. Fears related to immigration, the precariousness of industrial jobs, and a sense of cultural abandonment are fertile ground for the opposition. The Alternative for Germany, as we've seen, has managed to become essential in certain regions, where it now approaches 25% of voting intentions, which is very significant for Germany. Its growing influence weakens the traditional political consensus and discourages a disillusioned electorate. That's why the regional elections in 2026 are expected to be crucial once again. Baden-Württemberg, a historical stronghold of the conservatives, is seeing the black-green coalition falter. The Greens are losing ground, while the Christian Democratic Union maintains a comfortable lead. However, the rise of the Alternative for Germany and the increase in voter abstention reflect an electorate that is more volatile and undecided than ever. The same scenario is unfolding in Rhineland-Palatinate and Saxony-Anhalt, where political fragmentation is also pronounced. Berlin and Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, historical symbols of the socialist melting pot, have become battlegrounds where the traditional left is struggling to hold on to its base, sometimes against the Greens, but also, and above all, against the Alternative for Germany. This electoral chaos reflects a country in search of direction, torn between a desire for stability embodied by Friedrich Merz and his conservative charisma, worthy of a Volkswagen dealer in Westphalia, and a deep distrust toward institutions seen as out of touch. The era of figures like Adenauer or Willy Brandt seems truly over. The suspense about these election results is complete. They will determine in which direction Germany can or must move to then face these political, economic, and social crises that show no serious signs of easing. Despite Scholz's resignation and the holding of federal elections, Germany, once the economic engine of Europe, is still struggling in 2025 after declines of minus 0.9% in 2023 and minus 0.5% in 2024. The Mittelstand, once held up as an invincible model against economic turbulence and the industrial engine of the European continent, is stalling and no one seems to have the spare part. In August 2025, German industrial production took a heavy hit, dropping by minus 4.3% in a single month, the worst fall since March, which was the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The automobile industry, a national pride, collapsed by minus 18.5% due to extended summer holidays and a chaotic conversion of production lines to electric vehicles. The pharmaceutical sector, for its part, plunged by minus 10.3%, weighed down by weak global demand and persistently high energy costs. Finally, with minus 3.9% over 1 year, the German industry is accumulating costs and raising fears of a technical recession by the end of the year. With 2 significant consecutive quarters of stagnation or contraction, the country is already close to the classic definition of a recession. However, the Merz government is forecasting a symbolic annual growth of plus 0.2% in 2025. But institutes like the German Institute for Economic Research in Berlin or the Institute for the World Economy Kiel are anticipating stagnation at 0.1% for the year, or even worse. So, who is to blame? It's a toxic mix. The war in Ukraine continues to sabotage supply chains, with lasting effects on raw material imports, and German exports, which have dropped by 0.3% over the year. Finally, there's the energy crisis, deprived of cheap Russian gas, which is causing bills to skyrocket. Industrial electricity in Germany, for example, costs 30% more than in France, and it has contributed to a loss of competitiveness of between 5 and 7%, turning German export champions into energy-guzzling dinosaurs. The minimum wage, set at 12.82 euros per hour since January 2025, also weighs on labor costs, with a planned increase to 13.90 euros in 2026, which could add 1 to 2% to the costs for industrial SMEs that support the German industrial fabric. Add to that an aging population that is emptying the workshops of engineers, and you have the perfect recipe for shredded competitiveness in 2025. It's also China that is forcing a smile. It has seized the global leadership in electric vehicle exports and widened the gap every month. By 2023, Beijing was already exporting 50% more electric vehicles. 2 years later, the lead has become enormous, despite protectionist attempts by the Europeans. Volkswagen is closing or idling historic factories in Germany while opening production lines in Mexico and China. Badische Anilin- und Soda-Fabrik is operating at a slow pace, suffocated by unbearable energy cost. Nearly 90% of German industrialists see the future as bleak. Massive job cuts are planned, investments in research and development are frozen, and innovations are shelved. Macroeconomically, it must be said right away, stagnation is looming. The big Merz plans are like leaky lifebuoys, because without swift execution and deep reforms, they will be nothing more than a bandage on a hemorrhage. Germany is wondering how to revive its industrial giant in the face of ruthless Chinese competition, prohibitive internal costs, and an inexorable demographic aging. Energiewende, the great dream of German green energy, which is turning into a nightmare. Germany had promised wind and sun, but now the sky is taking its revenge. In the first half of the year, renewable production dropped by 5.4%, wind power collapsed by 31%, despite 2,100 megawatts newly connected. The culprit: weak winds, congested grids, and turbines giving out. Adding more wind turbines isn't enough when Mother Nature has the final say. To compensate, the state has found two emergency solutions: the good old coal power plants, whose production should be stopped by 2035 or even 2038, according to the German schedule. And finally, American liquefied natural gas imports are at the forefront, making up 94% of Germany's liquefied natural gas imports, followed by Nigeria, Qatar, and Angola as backup, and even discreetly, a little bit of Russian liquefied natural gas. The country's energy irony is that after shutting itself off from Russian pipelines, Berlin is still hooked on imported energy, which is more expensive in the case of liquefied natural gas. And on top of that, here, it's 94% American, but fortunately, there's solar power, which helps save face a little. With a 24% increase in energy production, driven by 107 gigawatts installed, that's a good result, but still not enough to make up for wind power. You should know that the Renewable Energy Sources Act 2023 law aims for 115 gigawatts of wind power and 215 gigawatts of solar power by 2030. But there are big plans, theory, and then there's practice. It's an administrative miracle since permits take 5 to 7 years, and land is becoming increasingly scarce. Also, without massive storage or a proper grid, intermittency remains a trap. In short, 80% renewables by 2030, but the government is already ordering convertible power plants for days when it's 100%. As a result, the transition is expensive for German industry, for households whose bills have skyrocketed by 12%, and paradoxically, for the climate. Berlin swears to make Europe greener, but for now, it's coal that has the last laugh. Fortunately, there's Russia, or rather the Russian threat. In 2022, Olaf Scholz promised, remember on video, a historic turning point, and pulled 100 billion euros out of the budget for the Bundeswehr. 3 years later, this fund is almost depleted. They had to go even further. 86.5 billion in 2025, 108 billion planned for 2026, and the stated ambition to reach 3.5% of gross domestic product in defense by 2029. In March 2025, the Christian Democratic Union Social Democratic Party coalition did what it had always sworn never to do. They blew up the constitutional debt brake to create a special fund of 500 billion euros over 12 years to turn Germany into a NATO fortress. The goal is no longer a secret: to become the leading conventional army in Europe again, with 10,000 additional soldiers as early as 2026, 1,800 Boxer armored vehicles already ordered, soon 3,550 F-35 S-60 Chinooks, a Space Command, permanent bases. In Lithuania, compulsory military service has not returned, but 18-year-old boys are now being registered, and the goal is to have 460,000 men under arms in the long run. Believe it or not, the industry is thriving because of this. Rheinmetall has just had the best half year in its history, with a 24% increase in revenue, 63 billion euros in backlogged orders. It's the 5th largest arms exporter in the world. The European Safe Plan, with 150 billion euros in loans, is funding shells, drones, and missiles, most of which are produced in German factories. Volkswagen, in the midst of a crisis, is already discussing conversion at 2 sites with Rheinmetall. Boris Pistorius, the German defense minister, is calling this a historic moment. All of this is happening, of course, with Washington's approval, which is applauding. Germany is back as a military pillar. But nothing is set in stone yet, because there's China, which supplies Germany with 65% of its rare earths and 92% of its permanent magnets, which now refuse any license for military use. Even a simple slowdown and the drone or F-35 production lines come to a halt. Inside the country as well, the trillions invested also result in cuts, for example in healthcare, pensions, and housing. And 72% of Germans say they fear for their purchasing power. I don't need to spell it out for you. The alternative for Germany at 24% in the polls just has to fan the flames. So Germany is trading its old model as Berlin's exporter for that of an armored vehicle manufacturer. And for now, it's working. Jobs saved, order books full, recession kept at bay. Defense acts as a sectoral stabilizer, which according to forecasts will even allow Germany to recover in 2026 or 2027 with around plus 1.2% gross domestic product growth, according to predictions. But for now, everything rests on 3 fragile pillars: fear of the Kremlin, the patience of the citizens, and the docility of Beijing. If even one of them gives way, the house of cards collapses. Let's continue now with social tensions. In November 2025, the seasonally adjusted unemployment rate, as recorded by the German Federation, stagnates at 6.3%, its highest level since 2020. With nearly 3 million unemployed since 2022, the German industry has already lost between 420,000 and 600,000 net jobs. Current announcements suggest an additional net loss of 200,000 to 300,000 jobs by 2030. In 10 years, that means between 700,000 and even 1 million industrial jobs will have disappeared, which represents a historic collapse of the core of the German model. Only public services, healthcare, and education are still creating jobs. The private sector is also struggling, as emphasized by Rainer Dolger, the president of the Confederation of German Employers Associations. The worst part is, as we often see in videos, the demographics, which create a gap of 400,000 engineers every year in Germany. Information technology specialists, qualified technicians in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics or industry, 4.0. That Germany is no longer training. Friedrich Merz has therefore played the Skilled Immigration Act card to bring Indian or Turkish brains, etc., to Germany, while double-locking the borders to asylum seekers, to appease his right wing and block the alternative for Germany. The problem is, he ends up displeasing everyone, both the business leaders who complain about the labor shortage and the working-class voters who cry out about an invasion. So it's a lose-lose strategy. Meanwhile, inflation remains at 2.3%, real wages are rising. Barely 4.8 million people are stuck in involuntary part-time work. An unprecedented effect since the unification of Germany, the East-West gap is exploding again, with 9% unemployment in the East and 5% in the West. Strikes, farmer protests, anger against green taxes. The country is rumbling. Apart from defense policy, which is still fueling German growth, the Christian Democratic Union is stuck in a complete deadlock. It can't throw open the borders without being devoured by the alternative for Germany, nor keep them closed without suffocating its industry. And in this vacuum, the alternative for Germany just has to reach down and pick up the pieces. Like the rest of the world, Germany is going through a turning point. The Merkel years are over. Under Merz, Berlin is opening its checkbook like never before. A historic shift enabled by a fast-track constitutional amendment. Money is flowing, interest rates stay low, and only Germany can afford this, while France is tightening spending to the limit. The message is clear: become the continent's undisputed engine again. With the enthusiastic blessing of Washington, Trump applauds, Merz smiles, and Paris watches the train go by. But behind the growth promised for 2026-2027 lies a harsher reality. Even as numbers rise, German industry struggles. Energy bills suffocate households, and more people are reaching their limit. The alternative for Germany, fueled by the Trumpist wave and growing anger, keeps rising in the polls and nears the threshold that could shake the whole system. In 2029, unless disrupted, Germans will vote again. If major investments haven't regained public trust, the Christian Democratic Union may face serious consequences for its stance and risk.